turn it over to our guest speaker tonight, Ed Engel, and he's going to present us something. It's actually two parts, and I'm not going to get into it. I'll let him get into it, but the first part is tonight, and the second part is next Wednesday night. Okay, so part one tonight, part two next Wednesday night. I'm going to just turn it over to Ed. Let him have it. Everybody, please give him a big hand. Thank you so much.
They got me hooked up here. Okay, is the mic working? Can people hear me? You got a testing 1, 2? Everybody hear me? All right, that's better. Okay, thank you very much, Doug, for your efforts in putting this together, and all of you that have worked to make this event happen. I'm so glad to be here and be able to give you some information which I hope is going to clarify some information for you, factual information. I'm sitting on the board right now of a nonprofit organization, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. It's been in existence since 2006, and we have been investigating the collapse of the 3 high-rise buildings that collapsed at the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And I'll get into the reasons why we're doing that. I don't want to belabor that too much at this point. But tonight we're just going to be talking about the 3rd building that collapsed, which is World Trade Center Building 7, a 47-story steel-framed high-rise building that collapsed at 5:20 in the afternoon, straight down into its own footprint in 7 seconds. And we'll be looking at the government report that explained why that happened. 2 government reports, actually. One was issued by FEMA. This World Trade Center Building Performance Study, which was issued in May of 2002, which was just a very preliminary examination of the collapse of the 3 buildings that day. And you can get this. If you go online. I would recommend people read it. It's just a preliminary examination of what happened, trying to raise some questions about why the buildings came down. So, first of all, I just want to make a quick count. It looks like we have about 40 people here. Are there any engineers in the audience? Okay, we got a couple of engineers. Congratulations, guys. You picked a good career. This presentation is meant for engineers. I will be skipping through some of the more esoteric and complicated technical matters for the purpose of getting to the meat of what's going on here for the general audience, so that you can understand why we're concerned about this. We'll be just looking at Building 7 tonight. And I also ask another question. How many people here generally were not aware of Building 7 up until this point, until you heard about this presentation? So we've got 3, 4, 5, 6 people, 7 people. Okay, so that's 7 out of 40. That's about average, actually. Sometimes, every once in a while, I hit an audience and everybody's aware of it. How many of those people that are here tonight generally are skeptical of the government explanation or aware of the government explanation of why that building came down? Just about everybody. Okay. All right. So I know who I'm talking to. And hopefully you'll find my explanation to be understandable. And if you have any questions, please try to hang on to them till the end. We can come back and we can cover anything you want to talk about at that point. This is just going to focus on the technical aspects of why those buildings came down and why we believe that the government explanation is not accurate. If you got something on your mind that just has to be said, go ahead and we'll take time for it. So this is a critique of the building failures and the progressive collapse theory. The government reports give the explanation for why those buildings came down as a so-called progressive collapse. In other words, something failed in the building at one point, it led to something else, which led to something else, and you get a domino effect, and then the building comes down at some point. So that's a progressive collapse. We don't think it was a progressive collapse. We think it was a global collapse caused by controlled demolition. But you'll see why we think that as we go through here, hopefully. These are the buildings that we're concerned with here. This is the North Tower, the South Tower, and Building 7, which is off to the north up here. This building was hit first at about 7:45. This building was hit about 17 minutes later, and it came down first. Then this one collapsed about 10:30, and then this building collapsed at 5:20 in the afternoon. So those are the three buildings that we're concerned with, just to refresh your memory. There were several reports that were issued regarding these failures. Just very quickly, the FEMA report that I just showed you, the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is a branch of the Department of Commerce, issued their report on the towers in 2005 and on Building 7 in 2008. Then there were a couple of privately funded reports because there was damage to the Con Edison station, which I'll go over briefly, and there was a lawsuit regarding that. The World Trade Center Property 7 was sued by Con Edison, and so this report was issued for the plaintiffs, and this report was issued for the defendants. And so they're not really relevant to what we're talking about here, but they do exist. And then there's a study that we funded. We paid the Department of Structural Engineering at University of Alaska Fairbanks under Professor Leroy Halsey to conduct a report, which he did over 7 years. He tried to replicate the NIST report on Building 7 alone, and he found that he could not make his conclusions come to the same place that they did. He said that it had to be a removal of all the columns in the building over 8 stories in order to get the behavior that you saw, which is equivalent to a controlled demolition, although he avoids that term. So here's a look at the building itself and the relationship it had to the towers. Building 7 over here, the 2 towers here. This is what it looked like. It would have been the tallest building in the state in 26 of our states. So this is not a small building. It has had an area of over 1 million square feet. Here's a look at it on the day of the event, taken from the north, and you can see the debris and the smoke from the towers that had come down on the other side of it, on the south side from here. It gives you an idea of how big this building was compared to the surrounding buildings. This is a footprint of the building. It shows that the building was actually built over a substation, a 2-story high Con Edison substation, and this is the trapezoidal footprint of the building, Building 7, and you can see the footprint of the Con Edison substation behind it. That was the source of the lawsuit. Of course, when Building 7 came down, it destroyed the substation beneath it. This is the floor plan of Building 7. So we want to take a look at this for a minute. It would consist of 58 columns on the exterior and 24 columns in the core. And then you had the floor beams and the girders that connected the columns together to carry the floor loads. So in the next frame, we're going to be looking, we're going to be standing here in the northeast corner of the building. We'll be looking west, so you get an idea of what this looked like in reality. Here's that picture. And so we're looking due west. This girder here and these beams that frame into it here are of what we're concerned with, because according to NIST, it was the fire that expanded these beams that pushed on this girder and dislodged it from its girder connection, from its connection to the column over here, and that led to a collapse of this floor on the 13th floor down to the 12th floor, broke that section of the floor loose. That cascaded down to the 5th floor. Then you had column 79, this interior column here was unsupported for 9 floors laterally, so it got wobbly and it collapsed, and then it caused the collapse of the buildings that are. So what you're seeing here is this section of the floor collapsed. It destabilized. It went all the way down to the 5th floor. This column here became destabilized. It collapsed and caused the collapse of these adjacent columns, which then spread throughout the core in succession. And then once the core had collapsed, the floor beams pulled in the perimeter columns and caused them to snap, and that's why the building collapsed. So that's their collapse theory. It's a progressive collapse theory. It had specific events. It was initiated by the fire effects on the beams, which pushed the girder off of its seat, which caused the floors to collapse, which caused the column to be destabilized, which spread to the other columns and caused the building to come down. It's a progressive collapse theory. It's a highly, let's put it this way, it's never happened before in history. And they admit that. The NIST report says this has never happened before in history. Fires have never caused a steel frame building to collapse, and this is a unique event. Well, as we all know, if you have a unique event, you need pretty unique and persuasive argument to explain that unique event. And so when we looked at their report on Building 7, the NIST report, which is about 1,000 pages, and we sifted through that, we found numerous problems with their explanation. And so we're going to go through those for a moment. This is just a view of the caissons, the foundation, how they went through the Con Edison substation with some of the caissons, and how some of them were outside. And so that's how they supported the building. This is a view when it was under construction. You could see the perimeter columns here, how they're braced. These are the interior columns. On top of the floor beams, they laid down corrugated metal sheets and rebar inside that, and poured concrete decks about 5.5 inches thick. So that's how they carried the load into the columns for support. Looking at the failure itself, here we see a picture of it before and after. This is what it looked like before. This is Building 1 here, the North Tower. And in 7 seconds, this building collapsed to a pile of rubble in 5 seconds. 7 seconds, it's about 5 stories high. So we're going to watch that. Pay attention to what people say as the eyewitnesses, what they observed.
For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Did they actually use the word brought down, and who was it that was telling you this?
The fire department. The fire department, and they did use the word. We're gonna have to bring it down.
We heard this sound. It sounded like a clap of thunder. It looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out. About a second later, the box full caved out. The building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
And I turned in time to see what looked like a skyscraper implosion. It looked like it had been done by a demolition crew. The whole thing just collapsing down on itself.
It was almost as if it were a planned implosion. It just pancaked.
So I think what's important there is that everybody that saw the building come down that day thought it looked like a controlled demolition. They said they've seen these things on TV, the high-rise hotels in Las Vegas that were brought down by controlled demolition. It's a very specific form of art, really, that there's a very few people in the world that know how to do this. And it requires very precise placing of explosives and cutting charges in a building. You have to understand the loads in the building, where they're being carried. This is not something that you can just make happen. And the reason they do it is because they want to preserve the properties next door. They don't want to cause collateral damage. So they want to bring it straight down into its own footprint. So that's what happened to this building. came down in its own footprint in a matter of seconds. It looks like a controlled demolition. This is something that the government studiously avoided. The NIST report specifically states that they never checked to see if there were any explosives placed in the building. Even though there were sound of explosives, there was explosive residue, they never checked the dust for explosive residue because, of course, explosions are going to leave a footprint in the dust of the building. Instead, they hauled all the debris away as quickly as they could, put it on a barge, and shipped it to China. So destruction of the evidence was a big part of why this evidence was never fully and properly explored. Yeah.
So, where did the fire come from? I know that where the fire came from in the two towers. But where did it come into Building 7? How do they explain a fire in Building 7?
Well, they explain that by saying, okay, where did the fires come from in Building 7? That's the question. And that's a big question. Because objectively, you say to yourself, well, wait a minute. No plane hit the building. There was no jet fuel in the building. Where did the fires come from? Well, there was some debris from the north tower that hit the south face of the building. We're going to look at that in just a minute. There was some light debris. There's 350 feet between the buildings. When the north tower came down, some of the debris was thrown outward and hit Building 7. So the only speculation that the government entertained was, well, that must have been what started the fires. But there's some problems with that because the fires weren't observed until well over an hour and a half after the building came down, after the north tower came down. And they completely ignore the fact that there were explosions reported in Building 7 itself at about the time between when the towers collapsed. They completely ignored that. They claimed there was no explosions in Building 7, and it must have been the debris from Building 1 that started the fires. It's problematical, but that's their story, and they're sticking to it. Okay? So here's a picture of it's hidden behind this building here, but this is the north tower coming down at 10:30 that morning. And you can see that it blew explosions. Well, they say there were no explosions, but it's impossible to conceive of any kind of force that is strictly gravity-led to push these massive beams and columns out hundreds of feet away from the building. But that's what they say happened. And so here you see Building 7 over here. You can see that some of this debris is going to come down and hit Building 7, and it does. However, the NIST report says that damage had nothing to do with the collapse of Building 7. And the reason why they say that is because if there was some damage to the south face of Building 7, guess what? Building 7 wouldn't collapse straight down. It would collapse to the south, right? So they can't hang their hat on that as a cause of the building to collapse. Here's the debris map that FEMA laid out. And you can see here's Building 1. Here's heavy debris. Here's light debris. And you can see here's Building 7. So some light debris hit the south face of Building 7. That's a fact. Here's pictures. Before, this is a walkway coming over from Building 5 over here into Building 7. And this is a picture of what it looked like after the Twin Towers collapsed. And you can see there's debris in the street, and it's broken some of the glass in the walkway. So yes, some debris did hit Building 7. There's some pictures showing what that damage looked like that day, some smoke, there were some fires in the building. So that's documented. NIST documented the damage to the building. They said there was some damage up here at the top of the building, there was some damage down here in the southwest corner. But again, they're not claiming that that had anything to do with the collapse. Here's a picture that day taken on the north side of the building and the east side of the building. You can see some fires down here. This is the lower part of the building. Here you see some fires that are proceeding along. These are, fires that are using office furniture and supplies for fuel are going to move because they run out of fuel, so they move. And So there was some fires that were documented on the 7th, 8th, 9th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 19th, 22nd, 29th, and floors 30. However, the floors from 19 on up went out very quickly because there was a gravity-fed fire suppressant system. They had tanks of water up on the 47th floor, and they fed a fire suppressant system for the top half of the building. The bottom half of the building, however, the fires were allowed to burn because the NIST claims that there was no water available to fight the fires. It's something that the fire department would have to hook up to their standpipes and pump water up to fight the fires. NIST claims there was no water to fight the fires. However, that's not true. The firefighters themselves have they've produced their own film. You can go to firefightersfor911truth.org. They have a film there that they produced within the last 2 years that documents the fact that there was water available, and it was supplied by the water mains and from fireboats on the river, and there was plenty of water to fight the fires. But they were told not to go in and fight the fires because the building was going to collapse. So that raises some interesting questions. How did they know that these complex events, which were going to lead to the collapse of the building that had never happened before, were going to happen that day? And why did they keep the firefighters out? So the firefighters were kept out, and the building later collapsed, and they said, well, it was the fires.
Sorry to interrupt, but basically, who are they that told the firefighters? I didn't want to wait to the end.
That's a very good question. There was supposedly somebody from the Office of Emergency Management, which was actually in the building. The 23rd floor of this building was occupied by what was called the Office of Emergency Management, which Mayor Giuliani had insisted be put in that building. The whole 23rd floor was essentially a bunker with lots of communication facilities and so on and so forth to fight emergencies. Because remember, in 1993, there was a bomb set off in one of the Twin Towers. And several people were killed, a number of people were killed. There was a lot of damage to the building, but of course the building survived. They repaired it, and life went on. But then they realized, well, the World Trade Center is a political target. Our enemies are going to want to bring it down. So Giuliani said, well, let's put an emergency management office in Building 7, which is nearby, and we can manage any catastrophe from there. However, on that day, when the North Tower was hit at 8:45, the first thing that they did was evacuate the Office of Emergency Management, and the entire building. So that by 9:30 that day, the building was entirely empty. There was nobody in it, with the exception of a couple of guys that wandered in there that didn't realize that the building had been evacuated. One of whom was Barry Jennings. You may have seen videos of him on YouTube. And he's explaining what happened to him that day. In between the time that the first tower came down and the second tower came down, he said there were explosions in Building 7. He was trying to get out. It blew him back up. He had to be rescued by the fire department. He was with another guy by the name of Hess. They both worked for the city of New York. And they had to be rescued, and they were gotten out of there about 10:30, 11 o'clock that day. So there's some anomalies here. Who were the persons that told them that the building was going to come down? Nobody has ever identified those people. They said that there was an engineer, supposedly from the Office of Emergency Management, that so-called went into the building, inspected the building, told them that the building was going to come down. It was showing signs of failure. Everybody had to get out. The fire department went along with that. They didn't question it. And even though a lot of the firemen on the scene said, hey, we could put those fires out, no problem, but they won't let us go in the building because they say the building's going to collapse. So this is highly suspicious. Yeah.
Was the verbiage that they used, did they say the building is going to collapse? Or did they say, you could be hit by debris? Do you know, what?
No, they said the building is going to come down. And you'll hear eyewitnesses that are firemen that are telling, before the building came down at 5:20, several hours before, they swept the area and they pushed everybody back. That's why all the videos you see only cover the top part of the building, because everybody else had been removed away from the building, and they were told that they had to get away from the building because the building was going to come down. In fact, the BBC reporter reporting events that day reported that the building had come down, and you can still see the building standing behind her. 20 minutes before the building came down, she reported that the building was going to collapse. So how did they know that the building was going to come down if this is a unique event in history? That's another big question mark. Who knew? And how come we don't have somebody's name and reputation attached to that allegation? Who was that person that warned the fire department to stay out of the building? We don't know. So again, just going over the essence of their analysis, these beams here on the 13th floor, these 5 beams in the northeast corner, got heated up by the fire, pushed this girder here off of its seat at this column, 79. This part of the floor collapsed all the way down to the 5th floor. This column failed, leaving these columns unsupported. They failed. The failure moved from east to west in the core, and once the core had failed, the exterior perimeter columns couldn't hold the load, and they failed, and the building came down. So that's their story. Just looking at the fires briefly, we can. This is important because the way in which NIST characterized the fires was that the fires in the northeast corner of the building caused the building to collapse, right, on the 12th and 13th floors. Here we see the fires. This photo was taken about 90 minutes before the building came down. So this is somewhere a little before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Look at the fires on the 12th and 13th floor, because that's where they say, this is the northeast corner of the building here. They say this is where the collapse initiated. Look at the fire on the 12th floor. It's all the way over here. It's already burned its way out. It's burned up all the fuel here. Here it is. It's over by column 52, 53, an hour and a half before the building came down. On the 13th floor, it's right there at about column 44, which was connected to column 79, but it's burning at about 100 feet an hour. It's moving. So an hour and a half later, it's going to be over here somewhere. So that's important to remember. At the time that the building came down, the fires on the 12th and the 13th floors were well away from the northeast corner of the building. So that makes their story extremely suspicious, because they're saying the fires were heating the beams over here at that time, but in reality we see that they were far away from that area of the building. These are the assumption and omissions. I don't want to go through these because it's long and involved, but basically NIST left a bunch of details out of their analysis, structural details that we know were in the building, and they misrepresented the dimensions of other structural elements. They said that the seat that the girder sat on was only 11 inches. It was actually 12. These are all devices that they had to put into their model to make it seem as if their system worked. So we'll look at those one by one as we go through here. This is the column. It had a seat that the girder sat on. It was 12 inches wide. They said it was only 11 inches wide. Well, that's to make it seem as if the girder could be pushed off. This is how the steel behaves when it's heated. These are the 3 temperatures. This is strength versus temperature, and how the steel behaves at different temperatures. And we can see that as it gets heated, when it gets up to about 300 or 400 degrees, it begins to lose some strength. And it loses strength according to this relationship here. This is stiffness, and you see again the same 3 temperatures, and it begins to lose some stiffness, the steel does, at around 100 degrees centigrade. So that's just to give you an idea of what happens to steel when you heat it. And this is an indication. They said that the steel was heated to 600 degrees. If we look at the beams were about 58 feet long, something like that. The maximum horizontal expansion that the beam could experience at 600 degrees centigrade is a little under 5.5 inches. That's not enough to push the girder off of its seat, because the seat is 12 inches wide. You have to get the midpoint of the beam more than halfway off of that. So it has to be pushed more than 6 inches before you're going to get that flange to curl up and the weight to cause it to fall. So even their own documentation and their own numbers don't work. And so this is a question you have to ask them. How did you get the beams to push the girder off the seat if they couldn't expand enough under the heat that you said that they were experiencing? There's something that doesn't add up here. Please explain yourself. As we can see, they refuse to answer these kinds of questions. This is a schematic of the girder. You can see here the cross-section of the girder. It's an I-beam, what's called an I-beam. It has a web, has a top and a bottom flange. And according to them, when the web got past the corner of the seat, then this lower flange would curl up and the girder would fall. I want to get a little better picture of it. Here's a little better picture of it here. Here's the girder. Here's the beam pushing on it because it's expanded. And here's the seat that it's sitting on. And what they left off was the fact that there was stiffener plates welded to the web and welded to the bottom flange at the end of the girder. Well, if you leave that off, then of course the flange is a lot weaker, and if the girder is pushed far enough, the flange will fail and it will drop. But if you have the stiffener plates in there, the thing is like 60 times stronger than it was without that, and it can't, the bottom flange can't curl up, can't fail. So why did they leave the stiffeners off? Well, their explanation was, here's another picture of it. You can see this is from their report. There's no stiffener plate here. This is looking at it from the column's position. They left the stiffener plates off. So when we asked them, here's photos showing that when it was under construction, there's the column, there's the girder, here's the stiffener plate. They were there. We know that from photos and we know that from the drawings. Governor Leroy Halsey, the professor that ran the study up at University of Alaska Fairbanks, he couldn't replicate their findings. And one of the things he said was, well, where's the stiffeners? Here's his model. He used a computer model. This is called finite element modeling. And with computers these days, we can put in all the characteristics of the steel and the frame in the building, and we can then heat it up and get the steel to act the way it would. This is a model, realistic model, and they're pretty good. So this is his abacus model of the 12th and the 13th floor. Here you see the perimeter columns, you see the core columns in here, and the stairwells and elevator shafts that were encompassed inside. So this was where they said the action happened. There's column 79. Now look at NIST's representation from their model of where the fires were. This is at 5 o'clock, 20 minutes before the building failed, and you see that they're showing, this is the 13th floor, they're showing that the fire is right there, hottest, in the northeast corner of the building at that time. But we know from the photographs that by that time the fire was all the way over here. So their model does not represent the reality that we can see with photographs. And so that means that their assertion that the fire was here and caused these beams to heat up at that time is not accurate. These are just models of the UAF model that they used of the floor. Again, column 79, the 5 beams, the girder, and so on. This is a picture of what it looks like if you have the stiffeners installed. This is from the UAF report, Professor Halsey. You've got the beams pushing the girder. The girder has stiffener plates on it. Even when you push the web well past the corner of the seat, the lower flange is not impacted enough to cause it to curl up and the girder to fail. So what we've shown here is that the initiation event could not possibly occur the way they said it occurred. The beams in the first place couldn't push the girder far enough. In the second place, they left the stiffener plates off. And then there's another problem, and that is that, well, here we have their admission that they left the stiffener plates off. This came from a fellow by the name of Michael Newman, who's in their public affairs department at NIST, and he says, well, you don't really need the stiffeners because the stiffeners were there to prevent web crippling and not to strengthen the flange. It completely ignores the fact that it would strengthen the flange. And of course, they have somebody write this who's not an engineer, because no engineer would say that. looking at the column had stiffener plates on it at every floor, and the stiffener plates stuck out past the flange of the column by about 1.8 inches. And that means that if you heat the beam and you heat the girder expands up against the flange of the column, and when the beam tries to push it off, the girder gets caught behind the stiffener plates. So there's another reason why the initiating event can't occur. There were shear studs on the girders, and the shear studs tie the floor system to the girders and make the whole thing stiffer. NIST left those off because they want to have maximum movement that they could get. So it's another reason for them to deny that they exist, even though they're shown on the drawings. There's a look at the shear studs, and you can do all these calculations and figure out how much it would have restrained the girder and beam and so on. I won't bore you with all those details. This is a picture of column 79 after the floors have collapsed, showing that the column would be unsupported between the 14th floor and the 5th floor. And this is nonsensical because their own data shows that there were other connections to the column in those floors, and you can see that in the diagrams from their own report. This is the 8th floor. This shows that there were connections to the column on the 8th floor. There were connections on the 9th floor, and there were connections on the 13th floor. So their claim that there was no connection here to restrain the column is false, and easily provable false by the information in their own report. Then if we look at the floor, well, what if the floors collapse? Well, here's the 13th floor collapsing down, the model that we built. It hits the 12th floor below. Would it break the 12th floor loose and cause a cascade all the way down to the 5th floor? No, it would not. It's not strong enough. You do an analysis of this system, and it doesn't hit the 12th floor hard enough to break the wells loose and cause that floor to collapse down here. So the cascade doesn't happen either. So far we've gone through every aspect of their progressive collapse, and every single one of them does not work. So that's what we're saying when we've got a problem with their report. It's not a single thing, it's not a couple of things, it's everything. It's their whole scenario. It doesn't work. This is our analysis of that collapse of the 13th floor. You have to find the frequency of this and the stiffness, and then you can figure out how hard it hits the floor below. I won't bother you with that. This is all the calculation. This is all to convince engineers. Engineers like this kind of stuff. You have to prove this with your models. You have to prove this with your equations. And so, you know, this is an engineering presentation. I would take more time with engineers, but everybody else is just going to say, oh, please, don't. So anyway, here's another aspect. They left off some stiffener beams on the northeast. This north beam here had some stiffener beams. It's really not that important. I'm not going to go into that. This is more of that, showing how the floor beams acted. Another thing that they did was they, in their model, this is from the NIST model, they systematically put in weaknesses in the floor beams in their model in such a way as to make the beams act the way that they wanted it to. But we all know that fire doesn't do that in a systematic way to floor beams. I mean, you can't go through and say, well, right here and right here on every beam, this is where the beam failed. That's not the way fires are going to work. So they did this because when these columns in here fail, they want these to act as tensile members and pull in the columns on the exterior. That's why they made it fail in the way that they did. So this is nonsense. This is garbage. This is a picture of a steel that FEMA found from Building 7, and you can see that it was severely eroded. And this is a high temperature action, and there were no temperatures of that magnitude in Building 7. All you had was office fires. Office fires will burn at maybe 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, something like that. Steel doesn't begin to melt until about 2,700, almost twice that. So what is it that caused this steel to erode in this fashion? NIST completely ignored that. They did, even though this was in the FEMA report, and the FEMA report is in Appendix C, and it's right there. There's the evidence. NIST had the steel, They decided they were not going to address this question because there's no way that they could explain it with office fires. This is the work of incendiaries. And that's the only way you're going to get that kind of treatment of the steel. This doesn't happen by magic, and it doesn't happen by office fires for sure. So there's another problem. Photographs taken afterwards, this is from the USGS aerial photo taken 5 days afterwards. They can tell from the infrared aspects of the photo that there were temperatures here. This is World Trade Center 1, World Trade Center 2, and World Trade Center 7. And these temperatures are up over 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. This was 5 days after, and these temperatures persisted for months afterwards. That's not office fires. That's not going to be caused by office fires. Never happened. So they, again, 9/11, the FEMA and NIST omitted any information here. Furthermore, there was eyewitness reports of molten metal in the basement of all three buildings. And molten metal, again, you're not going to get molten metal from office fires. You need to heat steel to more than 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit to get it to begin to melt. On the other hand, incendiaries like nanothermite create temperatures of 4,400 degrees and will melt steel with no problem. That's what they do. Now we're going to compare we're almost through here. We're going to compare the collapse of the building in reality with the video to the NIST model. And the NIST model is on the right here. You're going to see that their collapse begins down here as they predicted with their theory on the 13th floor. The column is going to collapse. It's going to bring down this penthouse on the top through the roof, and then the building is going to begin to fail. But notice that, first of all, their model stops only about 3 seconds into the collapse. And we'll talk about why they did that. Notice that the penthouse here is going to fall through the roof before the building begins to go down. Right there. And then this penthouse falls through, and then the building starts to come down. So that's proof that the interior columns failed first, because the penthouses are sitting on top of those columns. So we know that the interior columns failed first. Now look at the NIST representation. They have the column 79 failing and the penthouse falling through the roof, but they stopped their representation about 3 seconds into the total collapse. Now why did they do that? Well, it's because they're beginning to show distortions in the exterior of the building that don't show up in reality. You got distortions down here, distortions up here, distortions along here. It's crumpling up like a beer can. If your model doesn't represent what really happened, your model isn't any good. Something's wrong with it. That's why you make the model. This is taken from their report, and it shows what the building looked like a couple of seconds later. And this is what's happening. The top of the building has turned around more than 90 degrees at the long axis of the building, and it's really crumpling over. It's not coming down uniformly, so their model doesn't represent what really happened. Then there's the question, the all-important question of free fall acceleration. There's a physics teacher, David Chandler, who went to before they issued their report in they issued the report in November of 2008. David Chandler's a bright guy. He took video of the building coming down, and he said, let's see how fast it's coming down. And he proved that the building was coming down at absolute free fall acceleration for about the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, it starts to fall for about 3/4 of a second, and then it drops 110 feet at free fall acceleration. He can do that because he picked points on the building, he measured them, he had the time frame because, of course, he knew the speed of the film, so he could prove that the building was falling at free fall for the first about 2.5 seconds. Well, what does that mean? Things can only fall at free fall when there's no resistance beneath them. So that means that the entire superstructure of that building ceased to exist someplace in the building for 2.5 seconds. That's a controlled demolition. So that's why Professor Halsey came up with the conclusion that the only way that he could replicate what he saw was to remove 8 floors of columns all at once. And that way you can get it to drop for 2.5 seconds free fall. And that's what a controlled demolition would do, because you're going to remove those columns, you're going to use the entire weight of the upper part of the building to crush the lower part of the building, and you're going to bring it straight down. So the fact that NIST says nothing about this is an indication that they don't have an answer for that. And when we question them about that and we ask them to correct their reports, they simply reiterate their original story and they don't go any further. Here's his graph, Chandler's result. This is the velocity versus the time. So the slope of that line is the acceleration, and it turns out to be exactly the same as free fall. It goes from about 3/4 of a second to a little bit after 3 seconds, and then it begins to slow down as it hits resistance below. So that's the proof that all the columns over 8 floors had to be removed at the same time. If you use buckling like they do, if they say, oh, this is because columns buckled, there's always some resistance to the fall of the building, because the columns still exert some upward force to oppose it. So this is a problem for them. This is more explanation of that, basically, significance, what I just talked about. So we've proven that all of their assumptions, every one of them that they made that we have questioned, disproves their own theory. They have no evidence that would support their theory. And when we've challenged them in court to produce the evidence that would explain their theory, they simply are backing up into the corner and they're hiding behind their authority. They essentially they're not responsive. We have sent in requests to them to please explain some of these anomalies, and we get a response back from the director of the NIST. It says that if we give you this information, it might jeopardize public safety. So this is the first time in history that any authority whatsoever has cited the laws of physics as being a threat to public safety. So that's where we are. This is the kind of ridiculous position that we are in questioning the authority of this agency, because they simply hide behind their authority. So this is simply a reiteration of all the points that I've made here, with the missing information and the contradictions within their report and so on. So I'm not going to bore you with that. So that's the conclusion of this report on Building 7. Next week, we'll talk about the Twin Towers and the problems with that report. So at this point, I would like to open it up for your comments and questions. Yeah.
Okay. We do have people that are watching live stream, so if I could ask you to use the mic.
Seems like a reasons they had the controlled demolition to escort the gold out. I don't remember all the details.
Well, the way I heard the story was that the gold was at the basement of the building next door, Building 5 or Building 6, I can't remember which one. And there's reputed trucks that were caught in a tunnel hauling the gold out and so on and so forth. You know, I can't verify any of that. I've never been able to prove that one way or another. And I wouldn't go there anyway, because that's not what we're doing. We're talking about the technical aspects of the way the building came down. We don't want to be led off in those directions, because then people start saying, well, you're a bunch of nuts, you know, what are you talking about? This has not been proven. We can prove this stuff. This is the laws of physics and chemistry and so on. That's where we're coming from. We want a realistic evaluation of the evidence, because if you're investigating a crime, the evidence is the first thing that you have to ascertain the truthfulness of. Otherwise, your investigation is going to go off in some direction that's going to lead you down a rabbit hole. Yeah.
So I know some people have taken a look at nanothermite and tested for that. Do you guys have anything to say on those types of hypotheses?
We think the proof is very strong. In fact, it was Stephen Jones here, a professor at BYU, that did a study. He took 4 samples of the dust, and he found 2 things in the dust that would prove that nanothermite was present. First of all, he found some chips of unexploded explosives, which when he heated it to the temperature which would be required to ignite nanothermite, which I think was around 400 degrees centigrade, it exploded. And secondly, about 6% of the dust is made up of tiny little spheres of iron. And one of the byproducts of thermite when it burns, thermite is a combination of rust, iron oxide, and aluminum. And when they combine at a certain temperature, they are explosive or burn at high temperature, depending upon how you mix them and what size they are. And one of the byproducts is these little perfect spheres of iron. 6% of the iron, 6% of the dust was made up of these little tiny spheres. There's no other explanation for why those spheres are there. NIST tries to come back and say, oh, well, that was caused by welding, when you welded these things together. But not 6% of the dust, okay? It's an enormous amount of material, and it was spread out all over Manhattan. So this is another example of something that NIST doesn't want to address, or when they do address it, it's like, it's so implausible that you can't believe it. Yeah. Sir? Okay. Yeah.
The jetliners that struck the taller towers, to some degree, passed through those towers. Was Building 7 in the flight path, the aftermath of the trajectories of either of those jet airplanes?
No, there was no element of the planes that hit the building, the planes themselves. The debris came from the building, from the North Tower itself. Yes, sir.
So with the free fall, do they know what floors they think that were demolitioned?
That's a good question. If you'll notice, the videos that we have, you can only see the top part of the building from about the 18th or 19th floor up. And that's because they had moved everybody back far away from the building before it came down. So we don't have any video of the lower part of the building. So we can only assume that the floors that they took out were somewhere below the 17th floor. And that, because we can't see that. But if you'll notice, there were some of the eyewitness reports said, I saw the bottom floors cave out, and then the building came down. So somebody saw a lower part of the building, and we've got some photos of the building earlier in the day with debris outside the building. So our supposition is that Barry Jennings' report was accurate. There were explosions in the lower part of the building, lower down, earlier that day. This is strictly my theory. My theory is that they wanted to bring Building 7 down at about the same time that the towers came down. That way they could blame it on the debris from the towers, and they could clean it up immediately afterwards, and there would be no questions asked. Everybody would have said, well, yeah, the debris from Building 1 brought down Building 7. But something happened. I think they had a malfunction in part of their explosives. I think the lower part of the building went off, and somehow they had a malfunction with the rest of it. So between 10:30 in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 5:20 in the afternoon, they went into the building, they set the fires, they were going to use the fires as the reason for why the building came down, and then they brought it down later in that day. And you can hear people say, well, the fire department told me we were going to bring it down. So there was some knowledge that the building was going to be brought down. How did they know the building was going to come down? So that's my theory. I think it's the most plausible of from the information that we have. But because I don't see why they would want Building 7 to come down later that afternoon. It's like a sore thumb, right? It's not. Yeah, it's not like something and that's why you never see Building 7 on the news. There's no talk of it or whatever, because it's like, well, wait a minute, this is a big question, right? They don't want that question asked or answered. And I think it's because not everything went perfectly for them that day. And I think that was the one thing that really messed them up. Yeah. Who's them? Well, that's a good question. Well, the perpetrators, okay? Whoever did this, I'm not pointing any fingers. I don't know who they were. I'm saying that they obviously had they had inside access to the buildings because they had to pre-wire them before the day that happened. So they had powerful agents or perpetrators or whatever. And and this is the thing. This is what I'm on about. And what we're on about is that it's the leaders of our professions, the civil engineering profession, the structural engineering professions, the forensic engineering professions. They are the ones that are providing the cover-up story. I don't think they were involved in planning it. I think they were dragged into it, coerced into it, somehow incentivized to, money, threats, whatever. Here, you're going to tell the public that this story holds water, and then we can point to you and say, see, the Professional Engineering Association supports us, so therefore we don't have to look any further. But when we've taken this message of ours to rank and file engineers around the country, and we've presented this to more than 1,000 engineers, we've never had a single engineer tell us that they thought that we were wrong. And I'll ask my 2 engineers here tonight, what do you think? Does this seem plausible? Do we need a new investigation or not? What do you think?
Well, I'm an electrical engineer, so I'm kind of out of my realm there. But
Okay, well, but I mean, reasonably.
But reasonably thinking, I don't see any way that you drop straight down if you had one corner go out.
Sir, you would agree? Well, that's been, I'm not saying that everybody agrees with us 100%, because obviously I've given you a 45-minute presentation here, and anybody can make anything look any way you want. But if you go and do the investigation yourself, read their reports, read Professor Halsey's report, go to our website, look at all the information that we've developed, I think that you'll agree that a new investigation is necessary. This is not the way it was presented to us, and there's real problems with it. Yeah, sir, go ahead.
So, back to your question, I'm not sure who it was, but if you look at the video, there's 2 different angles that we have video from. And on one of those angles, you can clearly see squibs going down the side of the building on both corners. I don't know if you've looked at that.
Yeah.
But it's very clear. And what squibs are is those are the things where you have explosive charge planted and it blows out. So you can see an explosion. It's kind of like a cannon coming out of the side of the building. And you can just see it go down in a row on both sides. And then as far as like the censorship, they never could have pulled this off without the censorship that they've had with, and the cover that they've gotten from NIST and from the other engineers that they've roped into this. It's just impossible.
Yeah, if there were real questions asked, I'm convinced that we could have gotten to the bottom of it.
In fact, there was a professor at the New Mexico, I believe it's Institute of Mines, who came out like 2 or 3 days after 9/11 and said these were obviously controlled demolition. Okay, what happened? A week or 2 after that, he was given a $7 million grant from the government, and he changed his mind. Believe it or not.
Yeah.
True story.
Yeah, true story. Yes, sir.
The involvement of NIST is particularly troubling to me as a forensic scientist. When we do controlled testing, we don't just independently test something without a reference, and so we have reference materials that we test to see how they behave. Then we test against unknown materials from whatever criminal circumstances are being investigated, and we compare them against the standards to draw any kind of a conclusion. And we actually obtained a number of our reference samples from NIST. And so NIST is held up in the forensic science community as a ivory tower standard producer, and it's troubling to hear about NIST being involved in hiding behind their agency in producing explanations that don't have any standing in physics.
Yeah, this is a real concern, because once you allow false information to get into the literature of your profession, it's going to take over like a cancer, and pretty soon you'll lose your way, because you need to be founded. You have to have a foundation in basic science that works, and that we know is reliable. Like you say, you've got to be able to check it and reproduce it. In this case, we couldn't do that, and yet we're not being allowed to have that kind of discussion that would lead us to, what is really the correct conclusion, what happened. So this suppression, as this gentleman pointed out, of any kind of discussion is really what enabled this to happen, and it's going to have severe consequences for us going down the road, because we're going to be training engineers with false information. We are training them now, because this is being... I'll give you an example. I graduated from the University of California, Berkeley, in engineering. At that time, considered the best engineering school in the world, literally. And when Professor Halsey produced his report, we went back to the University of California, we rented a space in the faculty club there, and we advertised all over the engineering department that we were going to have this presentation of his findings for the engineering community there. You know how many engineering professors showed up? 0. And this was we made sure that everybody in the engineering department had the information that was what was going to be discussed, what the findings were, and we wanted them to come, and we wanted to hear what their questions were. Not one of them showed up. And on top of that, there's a student chapter of the American Society of Civil Engineers there amongst the students, and that student coordinator planned a extravagant lunch on the same day and the same time as we gave our presentation with a free food. So all the students went to that. So we got I think 4 or 5 students that showed up. So in other words, there's something deliberate going on here. These are people that don't want to discuss this issue whatsoever. And this is their job. This is their expertise. This is their field. Why not? Yes, ma'am.
No, just
okay.
one at a time.
Okay, sorry.
What's the significance of Building 7? I mean, I understand why they did the things with Buildings 1 and 2, but why 7? Why not 5 or 6?
Well, I think the answer lies in the tenants. And here's Professor Halsey's report, and he lists all the tenants in Building 7. So let's look at who they were. On the 7th and 8th floor, we had American Express. On the 9th and 10th floor, we had the U.S. Secret Service. 11 to 13, which is the critical floors where these fires were supposed to occur, that was the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, most people don't remember this, but the day before 9/11, on the 10th of September, Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon held a press conference, and he said that there was, I think, $3.2 trillion that were missing. 2.3. And they were going to investigate and find out where these $2.3 trillion had gone to. Well, the next day, when Building 7 went down, it's claimed that the records that would have been able to trace that down were held in part by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So that was exactly the floors that were on fire, and the building came down supposedly as a result of those fires. Some of the other tenants were Provident Financial Management, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, ITT Hartford Insurance, First State Management Group, Federal Home Loan Bank, and then the Office of Emergency Management on the 23rd floor, as I talked about. 24th floor was the Internal Revenue Service, and the 25th floor had the IRS, the Department of Defense, and the Central Intelligence Agency. And the 26th and the 27th floor was Standard Chartered Bank, and from the 28th floor up through the top was Solomon Smith Barney, which was later taken over by Citibank. So I think you know, if you look at, somebody wanted those records or those offices, I believe, destroyed. Otherwise, why would they do it? Because it posed a risk for them, actually. They didn't fly an airplane into it. So why would the building come down? It would raise all kinds of questions. There must have been something important there that they wanted to accomplish. I don't know what it was. Yes?
Okay, this is just more of a long time ago. I remember on the news back then that there was a building that they had an unstable foundation and they were going to purposely bring it down. And because it had been shocked so much that it said that the foundation was now uncritical and they were going to purposely bring it down. But I don't know if it was what building that was.
I think that was Building 7. I think that was one of the early reports.
That they were purposely, because I remember seeing it on the news that they said they were going to purposely bring it down, and then they showed it and aired it that it was on purpose.
One of our engineers that lives in New York said he saw the same thing. That originally, even Silverstein himself said that they were going to bring the building down, but then they realized, oh, wait a minute, that story's not going to work very well because you can't wire the building and bring it down in a matter of hours. You would have had to have done that beforehand. So they dropped that story after a while, and they went to the fire story. So as I said, I think that they had a problem with Building 7. It didn't go down when they wanted it to. They had to explain it somehow, and they kind of fumbled around coming up with Plan B there. And I think that what you're indicating there, that's the first time I've heard somebody say that they had actually heard that, besides one of our engineers that lives in New Jersey who said he was driving home shortly thereafter and he heard it on the radio that Silverstein said that they brought the building down with controlled demolition. He went back to that radio station later and tried to get the transcript of that story, and it had disappeared out of their archives. So, pardon me? Yeah, and he's quoted on TV, you know, in a video saying that shortly thereafter. And I think Silverstein and the team, or these culprits, whoever they were, hadn't quite got their story together at that point. It's hard to get everybody on the same page when you got a bunch of people telling a lie. Right. Right.
Ed, could you repeat the question? We can't hear what she says.
Well, the question is, she heard a broadcast saying that they were going to bring down a building on the site due to damage to its foundation that day, and that the building was brought down by controlled demolition. So I'm saying that I believe that they were referring to Building 7 in the early days because they really hadn't gotten their story together about how they were going to explain the building collapsed. And so even Silverstein himself made reference to bringing the building down with a controlled demolition. But, you know, they might have been speaking out of turn because they didn't really understand the process of controlled demolition. It's not you can just say, oh, we're going to bring that building down. Let's do it today, you know. It doesn't happen that way. Yes, sir.
Well, the question has exactly what to do, what you just mentioned there. So, of course, you can't do it in hours. I think it takes, I mean, if a building's gutted, how long would it take to rig it for demolition? And if it's not gutted, how long would it take?
Well, that depends upon how much information you have about the building. First of all, you're going to need the plans. You have to know what you're doing. You have to have the plans. Then you have to have the equipment and the personnel that has the experience to go in there. If you have all those things, you could probably do it fairly quickly. But you'd have to have access. And this is a building that was occupied up until that time. So that means that you can't get in there during the day probably and do this kind of work. You're going to have to go in at night. There's a lot of things that go into that whole proposition, but certainly not something that could be done in a matter of I would say if you had everything that you needed, it would probably take you several weeks.
This would be pure conjecture, an interesting theory that I was informed of in just recent days is that the plane that was brought down by the passengers in Pennsylvania may have been scheduled, in fact, for Building 7, as opposed to a Washington, D.C. target, as we have we have previously heard, and that lacking that alleged impetus of damage to the building with an airliner, they were left with the embarrassing, they were left with the embarrassing situation of, okay, we were lacking the trigger point for a building collapse, but it's got to come down anyway, so it went down. It's an interesting thought, but of course it's pure conjecture.
Yeah, it's conjecture, and there's no way to verify the truth of that.
So there's a couple things that you have to know about rigging. There's a couple things that you have to know about rigging a building that's changed. It used to be that you had to wire it, with control wires, so that you could time everything, and it was very tricky to do that. That's not how it works anymore. It's computer controlled, and everything's radio is done by radio. So it's a lot easier to wire up a building than it used to be, because you don't wire it up. That's the first thing that you have to know. The second thing that you have to know is that the security in Building 7 would have been incredible, because you had the FBI there, you had the CIA, you had the Security Exchange Commission in that building. Just the CIA alone, the security would have been unreal. Okay? The last thing you need to know, and you won't believe me, but this is true, George W. Bush's cousin was the chairman of the company that had just been awarded the security contract for the World Trade Center, about 6 months previous. You won't believe me, but you can look it up. That's true.
I'm not really sure how to word this question, but you say that they wanted that building to come down the same time as the towers.
That's my guess.
Okay. So if that's your guess, then you must think that they had planned the towers to come down for Building 7 to come down with them.
Yeah, pretty much at the same time. That's my guess. I think that would have been the least. That would have been the least obvious. In other words, if that happened, then in the chaos of the time, the chaos of the moment, it would have been easy to say, well, it was the debris from the towers that caused Building 7 to come down. And in fact, there was some damage to the building from the North Tower when it collapsed. So if they brought it down at the same time, there probably wouldn't even have been any video footage of it. Right? Because everybody was focused on the towers. And the information that you would have had about Building 7 would have been very, very sketchy. Which it was anyway, because they hauled all the debris off and they didn't allow people to investigate the steel itself. So that's just a guess. The question on everybody's mind, I think, is, well, why Building 7? What's the point? And that part I can't answer, and I don't think anybody can. We can only say that for some reason, whoever perpetrated this crime wanted Building 7 to come down, because they clearly wired it to bring it down. Yeah,
right.
Got a question back here.
Down, and I agree with that. Then the people who wired the building had to have wired it ahead of time, because the building was on fire. They couldn't have gone in there and set those charges while they're on fire. And I'm not an engineer either, but I understand that sort of an art, and there's only a select number of people that have the expertise to do that kind of work. And you probably need shape charges and whatnot to do that. But in any case, you're not going to send people in while the building's on fire to set those charges. So whoever it was obviously they had to know those planes were coming, right? They had to know that was going to take place in order to be ready to blow this building at the time, right?
Yeah, I would agree. Just as a note to that, I don't know how many of you ever heard of Danny Jowenko? Danny Jowenko was a demolition expert, Dutch, who was shown a video of Building 7 coming down several days or weeks after the event. And he was not told where that building was or the circumstances of its destruction. And he was asked what he thought looking at the video. And he said, well, that's a controlled demolition. And the guy that showed him the video said, are you sure? He said, oh yeah, that's a controlled demolition for sure. I'm absolutely certain. So several weeks later, Danny Jowenko died in a mysterious single-car accident where his car ran off the road and hit a tree. No witnesses, and so on. I think that was a little object lesson for people in the demolition industry, that not to be running their mouth about what they thought happened that day. It's a very small community, the demolition people that can bring down tall buildings. There's not that many of them around the world, and they all know each other. And Danny Jowenko, I think, was a victim. I mean, this is speculation. I can't prove this. This is speculation. But, you know, another item of similar, Barry Jennings, who was in Building 7 and was caught on video and was in Loose Change, the movie, and talked about being in Building 7 and witnessing explosions in that building early in the day. He died under mysterious circumstances in 2008, the same year that NIST issued their report on Building 7. So he was not around to take issue with any of their conclusions. And we've tried to run down the circumstances of his death and so on and so forth. We're having difficulty doing that. We're still trying. But these are some examples of, you know, there's another one. There was a fire expert. They worked for Hughes Associates. Hughes Associates they do fire analysis. They were hired by NIST as one of the contractors to study the fires in the buildings. They had a guy, and I can't recall his name offhand, but he was considered to be the foremost fire expert in the country. And he died mysteriously in 2003. And I think he had a reputation to uphold. I don't think he was going to, you know, it's very likely he wasn't going to go along with their story because he knew it didn't make any sense about the fires. So another mysterious death. And I think that these are, you know, this is all supposition and guessing and so on and so forth. But they're facts that need to be looked at in context of the engineering aspect of it, which I think are important. Yes, sir.
So I'm going to interject this about the insurance. And I'm reading this from the internet. Just months before 9/11, the World Trade Center was leased and sold to Larry Silverstein. They actually talk about his Jewish connections and the connection he has to the Committee of 300 or the World Trade Organizations. They actually do think that this was designed to take a lot of money out of the U.S. economy. This is talking about how before Larry bought the buildings, it had no terrorism insurance coverage or act of God demolishing type coverage. But 2 months before the World Trade Center disaster, he had bought the policy and implemented it for terrorism and acts of God. When the building finally collapsed, the insurance company contested it because they said it looked highly suspicious. He took them to court. The court awarded him $4,555,000,000 in the claim on the building. And of course, he didn't lose anything, which the building owners prior to him would have lost everything because it didn't have terrorist insurance. So if you don't think there's a conspiracy here, yeah, you haven't been reading enough.
There you go.
So, what did you say the name of that? Danny Jowenko.
Danny Jowenko.
So here's another thing that you won't believe, but you can look it up, and it's true. There's a company called Control Demolition Incorporated. It's East Coast, I believe New Jersey. Anyway, it's one of those few companies that actually could do this. It just so happened that the CEO at the time, the president of the company, Mark Loiseau, was in New York City that day and close to the World Trade Center, and had his seismographs that he used to track the fall of buildings, you know, when he would demolish a building. He had them set up that day. Strange.
Any chance all those people that died of suspicious deaths happen to be close friends or relatives of Bill and Hillary Clinton?
Well, we laugh, but, you know.
I apologize. The mic's giving me fits here, so talk and speak loud.
You know, I just want to put it in perspective a little bit. If people use a Weber grill with charcoal in it and those charcoals are glowing orange and it's very thin metal, that thing doesn't deform at all, right? You think about your fireplace that's made out of steel and you are burning your wooden logs and your fire in your fireplace can't heat that fireplace to glow 600 degrees C, which is dull red. It's just not possible to have a fire in that building heat up those steel beams all simultaneously to push that beam off. I mean, it's just common sense.
Got one up here, Doug.
Okay.
Looks to me like one of the biggest evidences of this was a controlled demolition is the building came down at free fall speed. I don't think you can physically, the physics is not possible to have a building come down at free fall speed when you got millions of pounds of reinforced channel beams coming down at free fall speed. The physics is just not there to have that happen unless, like you said, there's thermite or some kind of steel cutter to take out the structural support so it can come down at free fall speed.
It's the whole principle of controlled demolition. I mean, that's what you use. You use the gravity forces and remove all supports, use the weight above, crush the weight below, and the weight itself at the same time. That's why NIST does not address it. They do not attempt to give you an explanation that would explain free fall. They do not want to touch that one with a 10-foot pole.
Oh, just a minute.
We never really addressed you talked about the progression of the fire, but not what the initiating event was. At least I don't remember that, what caused the fire. Is it possible it could have been electrical fire? Because those can get pretty hot. Although it'd be hard to sustain. Is that possible? Because I don't remember actually that we established what started the fire, just the progression of the fire.
It hasn't been established what caused the fire. NIST claims it was the debris from Building 1, which I suppose that's a plausible explanation, but there's no other explanation other than maybe electrical fires. I don't know. That's a possibility. Maybe or arson. You know, so I would say that we're stumped right there because we don't have any definitive proof one way or the other. All we can do is make guesses.
If Barry Jennings was correct, and there is video evidence that he was, it could have been explosives, right?
Yeah, right. Or cutting charges. A lot of times they'll use cutting charges to weaken a structure before they blow it out. And the cutting charges could cause fires. There's a lady over there that wants, and a couple of people over there.
Just one comment about the substation beneath. That would have been able to be obviously compromised in some way if that was the source of the fire, for example. Did Commonwealth Edison or whomever the company was have any comment about their equipment?
If they did, I'm unaware of it. I know that they sued, their insurance company sued Silverstein and said that the cause of the destruction of their plant was the collapse of Building 7, and Building 7 had been improperly constructed, and that was the cause of their loss. The court found otherwise and said, well, this was an unexpected event, and no, you know, the court, whoever the court officer was that rendered this decision, it made absolutely no sense whatsoever, because they're saying, you know, they couldn't ascertain that there was ever going to be office fires in the building, which is, of course, ridiculous. You know, you design the building to withstand office fires. So the court cases and the arguments that were made in that court case are, in my mind, useless.
I'm just interested to know if you, as an engineer, as soon as you saw this
happening, did you suspect that there was? And then how did you get involved with all the other engineers to do all these studies?
Initially, like everybody else here that's old enough, I knew exactly where I was on 9/11 and what was happening. And as it so happened with me, I was involved in a crime myself. That is, somebody had stolen a car, and at 6 o'clock in the morning was stealing the tires in my driveway of somebody else's car. They parked the car in my driveway, and they were taking the tires off it. So I called the police. This is really irrelevant, but I called the police. They came and they arrested these guys, and the car was left sitting in my driveway. So they arranged for a tow truck to come and tow the car away. The tow truck driver arrived, and it was an old friend of mine I hadn't seen in years. So we were sitting there talking, and he got a call on his radio, and he walked over to the truck, and he came back and he said, "Somebody just flew a plane into the World Trade Center tower." And we were kind of caught up in our conversation. I said, "Boy, that sounds like a bad accident, you know." And then a while later, 20 minutes later or so, he got another call, and he came back and said, "Somebody just flew a plane into the other tower." So then, of course, everybody, I think, woke up at that point and said, this is not an accident. This is a serious thing. But I was caught up in the events of the day, and also I had some other problems with my mother being ill, my son being incarcerated, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't really have that much time to devote to it. But I was interested in it, and I wanted to see what the explanation was for the buildings coming down. And I hadn't heard about Building 7 at all, because I wasn't watching TV later that day. I didn't see it come down. They didn't talk about it. And so I wasn't aware of it for a long time. It wasn't until I heard a radio station, KPFA, in the East Bay, where I was living at the time, and there was an architect on there, Richard Gage, and he was saying, "Hey, these stories about these buildings coming down doesn't make any sense." And he was going around and giving talks about it. And so I went and saw one of his talks. I thought that was interesting. And he presented a scientific explanation for controlled demolition. We didn't have a lot of evidence at that time, but he was saying, "Hey, just follow the scientific method, and it doesn't work," okay?
What was the date of that? How soon after? Was that like within a year before this report came out of 2000?
That was like I would put the date at about 2004, 2005. See, because the report on the towers didn't come out until 2005. So I would put it right around that time, because he looked at the report, which, the report on the towers is 10,000 pages long. So, this is just a guy who was working as an architect, and he was saying, this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. And so he was giving these presentations, and I went and saw one, and he had a petition there you could sign if you were an engineer or an architect. I signed it. And then later they contacted me and said, "Do you want to be active in doing anything about this?" And I said, "Yeah, I do. It's important." So then I gradually increased my participation over the years. And when they put me on the board in 2016, I said, we need to focus on the engineering community, because Richard Gage was an architect, and he was focusing on the architectural community and trying to get them to take a position that the government reports were wrong. And the architects were saying, "Oh, no, we're not going to do that. This is not our matter. It's an engineering matter, not an architectural matter. This wasn't an architectural failure. This was an engineering failure. And we're not getting out in front of the engineers on this." So at that point, up until that point, the board had been dominated by architects. And he came to me and said, "Would you come on the board and focus on the engineering community?" So that's when I came on the board. I founded Project Due Diligence. I recruited a lot of engineers off of the petitions that he had gotten signatures from, like me. And I've now got, we've got 40, 45 engineers around the country doing these presentations to groups like you, focusing on the engineering community, but we'll take this information to anybody that we can, because it's going to take a lot of pressure, and we need to focus on the engineering community, because if we could get them to change their position, NIST wouldn't have anybody to fall back on, and NIST would be under pressure to open a new investigation. So we're trying to focus on the leadership of our own organizations. So that's kind of my little story in a nutshell.
I'm going to get away from the explosive end of it for a minute.
As an engineer, do you know what kind of material was used on those beams? Was it high 80? Was it mild steel? Was there any investigation into the welds themselves? Was the rip pass clean? Was all that?
Well, we have.
'Cause I've seen welds break under mysterious circumstances, like
Yeah.
it's too cold or
Right.
it's too hot. Or
Well, all we have is the inspection reports, which it was, it had to pass the code at that time, so that meant that there were inspections. And most of the steel was used in it was A36 in Building 7, which is standard, structural steel. Unlike the towers had like 5 different grades of steel, all the way up to stuff that could do 100,000 pounds per square inch. Pardon me? High 80? Yeah.
Just for very stressful situations.
Right. And the towers were put together in a way that, well, we'll talk about the towers next week. And, that was a completely different animal because it was built earlier, for one thing. Building 7 wasn't completed until 1987. The towers were completed in the early 70s, so it was like a 15-year time difference. So there's difference in the codes and so on and so forth, and the steels that were available, et cetera. Yeah, well, we relied on the inspection reports, and they tested the steel afterwards. They found the steel met or exceeded all the specs. So, yeah. So there was never any reason, nobody raised any issues with the materials or the construction techniques. It's true that there's some criticism that the core of the building, Building 7, could have been made stronger. The connections could have been stronger, but they seem to be focused mainly on the lower floors of the building where it went through the Con Edison station. And it wasn't that the building was found to be defective. It's just, it could have been stronger. Yes.
So I'm impressed with the presentation that you give, partly because it's so limited. The scope of the things that you're talking about is really limited within like engineering, but it's so thorough. The depth of it is a little bit overwhelming, and it's kind of impressive. Like there's so many different things. It's not one or two things. So I don't know. I think that everything that you pointed out, it builds a question mark. It's like, so all the evidence that you mentioned, being able to find an answer to that, I think is what we're all kind of preoccupied with. And I think that's part of the purpose of the presentation that you give. When I spoke with you earlier, you mentioned that part of your purpose was to spark an investigation, right?
Yes.
Right. And so could you talk a little bit more about that, about the investigation that you want to take place based on your evidence?
Yeah, okay. The investigation was carried out by NIST. It never should have been carried out by NIST. NIST is a branch of the Department of Commerce. The Department of Commerce is a cabinet position with the executive branch of the government. The executive branch of the government was a part of what happened that day. They were tasked with protecting us. They did not do so. Therefore, they had a dog in the fight. They never should have been part of the investigation. The little history here about this kind of a situation has to do with, we're all familiar, I think, with the National Transportation Safety Board, which examines the failure of airplane crashes and airplane disasters. The reason why NTSB was originally part of what was then the Federal Aviation Agency. It was a branch of the executive branch of the government. But in 1931, there was an airplane crash in Kansas, and it killed Newt Rockne. And Newt Rockne was an American legend, the coach of the Notre Dame football team. Everybody loved him. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up for his funeral. And his plane crashed because it had been put together. It was a wooden plane. It had been put together with glue. It flew through a rainstorm, and the rain dissolved the glue, and the plane fell apart. This was a very embarrassing situation for the airline industry in general, and the FAA acted in a way to try to conceal this information from the public. And when the public found out about it, they got very angry. And they demanded that there be something done about aircraft safety. And that was the origin of the NTSB. But it was originally under the FAA, and the failure of the FAA to properly examine that incident caused the government to say, okay, we're going to set the NTSB aside. It's not going to be part of the executive branch of government, and therefore we can hopefully get an objective report when something like this happens. So that's what should have been done in this case. It never should have been handed over to NIST. When the Congress said, we're going to have an investigation, NIST, we want you to do it, the executive director of NIST should have said, no, sorry, we can't do it, we've got a conflict. And you need to get an independent board. So that's what we're asking for, an independent investigation made up of people who have the expertise, who are not compromised in any way, who have no connection to the event in any way that would benefit them one way or the other, according to the decision that they made. They should have subpoena power, and they should have the ability to, the money to produce a report, do a thorough investigation, call witnesses, produce a report, and present it to the Congress and the American public. That's what we're calling for. We're not calling for another NIST investigation. NIST is compromised, and they showed that by the way in which they conducted this report. So that's all been settled. We need to have an independent organization. That's what we're fighting for. Whether we'll ever get it or not, that's another question. But I think that's a question of, things happen down the road. We never know what's going to happen. We have to keep doing our due diligence to bring this story out. And that's why I thank you all for coming here. I hope you all will go to our website, ae911truth.org, and investigate the information there. You can donate there. We depend upon the public for our ability to survive. I serve, and most of the people serve, without any pay. We try to keep our expenses to a minimum, but we do need an office manager. We do need somebody to manage our website. We do need somebody to pay the expenses of the people that have to travel and give these presentations. And we have other, backroom expenses. If you can give us $5 a month even on a regular basis, so we have an income that we can count on. In the past, we've made the mistake of depending upon some big donors that came to us with a lot of money. But when they withdraw, we're all of a sudden in a financial crisis. That's not the way we want to operate. So we're asking for your support to help us continue on. And we're not promising that we'll ever get an investigation. All we're promising is that as long as we have the means, we are going to continue to pursue this.
Okay. And one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay.
In a way, I apologize for the comment I'm about to make, but as with 30 plus years of experience in the criminal justice system and seeing what cases go to court and what cases get prosecuted and who's found guilty and what ramifications the guilty face, if this is a conspiracy, a criminal conspiracy, a huge conspiracy, as it appears to be, the fact that all the evidence has been destroyed will probably prevent anybody from ever being held to account for it. But it's very important, obviously, that you and others knowledgeable that see the video find the problems that are with it and communicate those to as many people as possible is incredibly important to prevent something like this being replicated in the future and then covered up so brusquely. But as long as there's no evidence that can be investigated, that can be analyzed, all the agency, all NIST, all the government has to do is remain mum at this point, and nothing's going to happen to anybody who's responsible unless direct evidence of the conspiracy, documentation, communications are revealed. I doubt that that'll happen at this point, but it's an ugly truth to look at.
Well, you make some good points. As a result of that understanding, we are now focusing on, we're putting together what we call a dossier on persons of interest. We know the people that participated in the cover-up. We know the engineering personages who were called by NIST to come in and participate in the evidence, the examination of the evidence and the production of those reports. So a lot of those people, now they're 21 years older. Some of them have already died. A lot of them have retired. Some of them may have something to say at this point, deathbed confessions and what have you. People that know can say, well, I was involved in the production of this report and so was the one that was making the decisions that were compromising this report. So we can follow the chain of evidence to a certain extent because we know the personages who were involved. We've got the names of all the people that produced the FEMA report. We've got the names of all the people that produced the NIST report. We've got the names of all the people that were involved from ASCE and from the Society of Structural Engineers. And so, you know, we're gonna start. We've already started calling those people and saying, would you like to talk to us about what you witnessed and what you were part of that day? And obviously, you know, most of them don't want to talk to us. But, you know, you don't know. Those are leads that we can follow, and we will follow them. So, you know, we're not done until it's a historical event and everybody's dead.
Okay, Peggy.
Okay. I was wondering, other than donating, is there anything that we can do to help you? And also, is there any type of maybe a documentary in the works that you know, your team could put together to educate the majority of, you know, the public, so that more people are aware that our government that something's not right with this, and maybe it would force them to look at it again?
Well, thank you for that question, and it's an important one. I've got a sign-up sheet here. You can sign later, give me your contact information, and we will contact you and see what your talents are, what your skills are, what your time is, and what you can do. We have people that do research for us. We have people that contact other people, and there's various things that need to be done in the back end of an organization, as you know, I'm sure, and we're no different. And we need people to do that, and that's how we meet people and we spread our influence, and it's important. So that's one of the reasons why we're out here doing this, because we know that there are people that come to us with skills and they want to help, and that is important. So, you know, if you want to sign up and let us contact you, we will do so. And yeah, it takes more than money. It takes talent, takes commitment, takes time. Oh yeah, sorry. That's my wife. She was born on 9/11. And she's the one that really has inspired me to follow through on all this. I never give her enough credit, but I couldn't do anything that I'm doing without her. I do have some DVDs here and some other literature from, which you can also get through the website. You can buy, we have a store and they'll send you the stuff. But I do have a few things with me if you would like to take them, and you know, you can donate whatever you can. It's all part of education.
Thank you, everybody. Let's give Ed a big hand.
Thank you.